So welcome everyone to this evening's event, the Round Table and exhibition next door, Mean Home, curated by Real Foundation. This is the 5th event in our program, Brave New World, and Claudia Clemente will shortly be introducing our 3 speakers, who are Jack Self, Director of Real Foundation, Giacomo Adesio, Co-Director of Fosbury Architects, and Adam Nathaniel Furman, who we're delighted to welcome back as former BSR Rome Prize winner in architecture. Over the last year, we've been exploring the changing role of the architect and questioning whether younger designers are driven by a renewed social consciousness and more utopian ideal of what can be done by design. And this evening, amid the ongoing Brexit gloom, it's really encouraging to see young Italian and British architects finding ways of working together on the very urgent problem of housing. Our architecture programme would not be possible without our sponsors, who are Alford Hall Monningham Morris, Bennett's Associates, Marcus Trust, Eric Parry Architects, John S. Cohen Foundation, Brian Guinness Charitable Trust, and Jamie Fobert Architects, as well as a special thanks to the British Council for collaborating on this event. So our chairwoman tonight is Claudia Clemente, an old friend of the BSR. Claudia is the co-director of the renowned Roman practice Labix that she founded in 2002 together with Francesco Isidori. Since 2001, she has taught exhibit and public design at La Sapienza, and she's also visiting professor at Cornell University in Rome and Ithaca, New York. And their magnificent monograph, Labix Structures, was published this year by Park Books. So please welcome Claudia Clemente.
Hi everyone. First of all, I want to thank the British School at Rome, and I will shortly introduce our guests. I will start from Jack Self. He's an architect and writer based in London. He's the founder and director of Real Foundation, an organization concerned with alternative forms of development, property, and ownership. And he's also editor-in-chief of Real Review. Then Adam Nathaniel Furman. Adam directs Southern Space, a color research cluster at Architectural Association, as well as running a studio Productive Exuberance at Central St. Martin, a former BS Rome Prize winner in architecture. Finally, Fosbury Architecture is an Italian architectural design and research collective based in Milan, Rotterdam, and Hamburg. Founded in 2013, Fosbury Architects engage in a wide range of projects from urban strategy to domestic environments, and from independent fanzines to labyrinths. Thank you to everyone. I invite everyone here to show their presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Do I put it on? Yeah, super, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, and also thank you so much to the BSR for the generous invitation to come and do this show. It's really a pleasure to have done this show. First I want to tell you a little bit about Real. Real is an unusual model. I mean, part of the questions that we've been talking a lot about during this exhibition is what the future social role of the architect might be. In the case of Real Foundation, of course we are a foundation, but normally foundations have some sort of wealthy patron who gives them a lot of money. We don't have any money. But the idea of a foundation structure is, in the United Kingdom, we don't have, as in countries like America, many different distinctions of for and not-profit institutions. We can't be a charity because charities have to have a named benefactor. And of course, the general public and architecture are not benefactors. They're not specific people. So as a result, we adopt this idea of a foundation, which means that we're a limited company, but we're obliged to follow our founding principles. This is some of them which we have, but in summary, basically, we can only take on projects which promote democracy, inclusivity, and equalities of many kinds, amongst them but not limited to gender, race, class, wealth, and space. And this, of course, is an acknowledgement of the way in which the architect is used as an instrument of power by other forces in society. We can't control everything. We can't also always initiate projects. We have to be prepared to work with entities who are in really significant positions of power, because if you wish to promote these types of ideals, you do have to do that. But at the same time, how can you, rather than standing always in opposition to, let's say, power that you disagree with, how can you create a structure where you feel comfortable and confident to do that without undermining your own values? And I think REAL is a kind of ongoing experiment in how to do that. Of course, then we basically do 4 types of projects, I would say. We do architecture projects, and we're working at the moment on, we work almost exclusively on low-cost housing, and we are getting very close to realizing some low-cost housing. So hopefully I will be invited back again, and I will show you that. We do, let's say, in the words of, I think it's Rumsfeld, it's always a battle for hearts and minds. We have not just, let's say, to build a new type of housing, which is predicated on very different relationships, particularly of gender and economic relationships inside the domestic space. But we also have to try and communicate this to other people. So we publish books. This is a historical book we did about Mies van der Rohe's only project in UK. We also publish it's not an architecture magazine actually, it's a contemporary culture magazine called Real Review, which has the tagline, What It Means to Live Today. And we've been doing that now quarterly for the last 2.5 years. Actually, we say it's quarterly, but it's conceptually quarterly. It's actually 3 times a year. But in a way, there's some importance or significance to that as well. Because, well, I won't go into too much detail about Real Review right now, but it's a way for us to promote our ideologies through other mainstream engagement, and at the same time use it as a platform for research. And of course, the 4th category we do is exhibitions and other types of cultural projects, whether that's curation. So we curated the British Pavilion at the 2016 Venice Biennale, which I think is probably our, let's say, conclusion of the best hits of. But today I'm talking about, of course, Mean Home. Mean Home is a super interesting concept for an exhibition in a way, because it's premised on basically, first of all, trying to explore cultural relationships between Italy and Britain at a time in which Britain basically has stopped being interested in Europe. And of course, it's also comes within a very specific collaboratory framework. So the question was, how could we create a way to work when we were also very separated? Even Adam, who we live in the same city, I don't see him that frequently. In fact, I'm almost more likely to see Fosbury. So the strategy we developed was one of what I would call the exquisite corpse. So in essence, we set an initial brief, which was we were interested in typical housing, and this is what mean means, the medium or the typical. So we did a lot of statistical analysis of both Italy and the UK to understand, how many rooms, how many square meters, what's the cost, what's the geographic distribution, what's the demographics, what can we say is the typical Italian and typical British home. And of course, this in itself is a rejection of a pattern of architecture which existed up until 2008 and still goes on in some forms, which is, and in fact, actually, I should be clear, this is the entire history of architecture. There's only very few exceptions to the moment when architects have not been responsible for exceptional and special and iconic projects. As instruments of power, we, of course, are called upon to produce monuments of different kinds. But we feel at Real that it's much more important to address the everyday, because if you can make a change to the everyday, you can have a much greater impact on society than if you concentrate on just making things that can't be repeated, that are singular or exceptional. So we began with this study, and then we asked, we worked with Fosbury. Fosbury designed, as they will present to you, the ideal British home, and we as British architects designed the ideal Italian home, which I'm very proud to present to a largely Italian audience, see what you think of it. But in a sense, this is not just a statistical project. It's not just a question of deciding how many square meters. It's also a question of cultural interpretation. What is it that Italians think the British home is like, and what do they imagine it could be? And the same goes for us. So these are some of the, I won't present all of our research, which I think Fosbury will go more into some of the work that they did, which was truly exceptional. It's a shame we should do another book, actually, just of their research into the British home. It's quite amazing. But as you can see, there's a kind of comparison on the right-hand side of children. We found that in Italy, we suspect, we don't entirely know, but we suspect that the reason that the Italian home has so much more children is because of adult children living at home, whereas, what, is this funny? Of course, it reflects a particular moment in our society, right, where it's extremely difficult to become financially independent and to leave the home. But this, let's say, is a real condition that we want to address. And apart from that, you'll see that the UK home has more rooms, but overall size is much smaller. So British houses are made up of lots of little spaces, whereas Italian houses are, on the whole, bigger with bigger rooms, which we like. And the cost is also quite interesting. I mean, Italian homes are cheaper, but maybe something else is that the Italian home debt to GDP is a lot less than in Britain. What this basically means is that Italian homes have less household debt. They have much more savings, so their mortgages tend to be smaller, and I mean, maybe this will come as a surprise to you, because I'm sure, of course, when it comes to national debt to GDP, Italy has one of the highest levels in Europe. But actually, at the household level, it's nowhere near as bad as Britain. I mean, the average British person almost owes as much money as they make. So they almost, if they were like a part of a EU fiscal bailout, they would be in a really dangerous condition. So then the question is, how do we take these statistics and how do we turn this into a proposition for a type of architecture? This is the home on the left that we designed, and we began from Palladio's Villa Rotonda. This is partly a reflection on the fact that Palladio was the first architect ever to use the dome inside domestic architecture. Before this, it was exclusively a religious typology. And the consequence of that, what he does is he makes a comparison between the sacred nature of the house and we thought this was quite powerful introduction, or let's say powerful addition to sphere of architecture from Palladio. And so we're very interested in, let's say, the idea of the everyday dome, or the everyday domestic sacredness. I hope you'll forgive me. I'm just going to very briefly geek out on a plan, because we don't get to often, let's say, discuss these types of things. But a lot of the work that we do, we're trying to resist the history of functionalism. The reason for this is that functionalism is very much an ideology about designing a space which perfectly meets the requirements of a particular action. It comes from the history of industrial production lines, and therefore the difficulty with this is that once you optimize a space for a particular action, you can never adapt it in the future. So the kitchen is probably the most perfect example. Most modern kitchens, of course, come from 1926, from the Frankfurt kitchen, which was a really radical invention to improve to reduce labor for the woman inside the house. It didn't ultimately work, sadly, but the point of it is that if you get, for example, a group of Italians inside one of these kitchens, which are only 1.2 meters wide and are optimized for one person to operate, of course, Italian culture has a much more collaborative or communal history of cooking, which means that people are always walking into each other. You can tell when Italians get into an English kitchen, the difficulties that they have. It becomes almost like a kind of farce, like a comedy in itself, watching people try to use this space in a way that it was never designed for. So, of course, in that sense, how can we design architecture which is useful, which has the right spaces and provides us with the right amenities, but which at the same time is not prescriptive, which doesn't dictate to us how we can live? And so this is what we tried to do. We used a proportional system, and basically you can imagine potentially that these are bedrooms, maybe this also could be a bedroom. The house itself has a very large entry because there's never enough storage in houses. We seem to accumulate more and more objects with nowhere to put them. and the center of the space is dominated by this dome. This, I guess, is a kind of sitting room, which leads to a patio in the back. And so you could imagine that these are maybe 2 bedrooms. Perhaps if we think that there are 2.4 people and one of them is a 0.4, it could be a couple who are in here and a baby who is nearby. But as you get older, a lot of the difficulty with how we design houses at the moment is we have a corridor with all the bedrooms next to each other. And this means that you have adults who share a wall. And it's really uncomfortable at the breakfast table the next day if you've heard your housemate having sex the night before. One never really knows what to say, I find. And so in this idea of always having a space or a break between rooms to make sure that each one always has a certain level of privacy. And beyond that, of course, one of the things that Marina, who commissioned the entire exhibition and has been extremely supportive as it's developed, she was very concerned that there's basically only one WC and one bathroom. But I think this, my reflection on this would be that we tend to have too many bathrooms anyway. I've noticed that in Britain now, every house has to have its own ensuite. And what you end up with is basically apartments inside houses where people live in their bedroom, they have a workspace there, they sleep there, they take their meals there, and they have a bathroom which is attached to it. And at which point, why you even live in a family? I mean, you may as well dissolve the family. And the family bathroom perhaps becomes a focus for other types of conflicts in domestic life which should be resolved rather than avoided. Maybe the final comment I think I will make, oh no, I'm so sorry, I better move quite fast. This is a perspective that you see through the center of the house, and one of the discussions I had with Adam was about the use of ornament, because of course architecture is not just about material honesty and space, it's also about questions of ornament. And for me, these 3 columns are a type of ornament. Although they have no decorative value, they're non-structural as well. This door could very easily be open, it's only 2 meters wide. The purpose of the columns is to draw the eye from the interior through into the private space and out into the garden. That's the dome in section. You can see it's pretty hilarious to have such a strange form inside a house for me. But this is something that I want to touch on, and I know that Adam is going to talk about our collaboration a bit more. But in essence, the question is then how to make an exhibition. How should architects do exhibitions? And we have not unlimited budget. We can't recreate things in a total way, but at the same time I like to have very tight control over how it is work is experienced. And so the idea was, rather than transform the space of the gallery itself, to put all of that energy into creating objects which contain the work. So we have a series of 4 maquettes which are inside the largest of the volumes that you'll see in the gallery space, and each one represents an exterior and interior perspective from our project and from Fosbury, and they're housed inside this, which is basically an exercise in color and proportion. And from every angle you perceive a different composition of colors, and I'm not going to tell you too much about those colors. I'm going to let Adam go into that research a bit more. But let's say there's also a contrast in each of these elevations between English and Italian ideas about what constitutes beauty, I think. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Giacomo Ardesi. I'm here to represent actually all the members of Fosbury. Claudia is here today in the first row, but the other 3 are back in Milan. And we'll start by showing you a little bit like from where we started, in order to for you to understand why we decided to work in this specific and peculiar way as a collective does. So this is an image of Dick Fosbury, and Dick Fosbury was basically an average high jumper that by just simply reinventing a way of, let's say, performing the jump, won the gold medal at the Olympic Games in 1968. So let's say we got him as a guru for our practice. That started back in 2013 while we were in school, and we were trying to find a way to, let's say, position towards somehow a labor market that was not ready to accept us, because back then, as most of you probably know, let's say there is not so much space for young architects, and on the other hand, we were trying to find a way in which we could put together all our knowledge and energies to make something meaningful. What we literally started from was some sort of very naive manifesto that was really like one of the first activities that we took as a collective project that was meant to be like some sort of coming-of-age romance that, in order to be published and broadcasted to a larger audience, was printed on the back of a kebab advertisement. And that eventually led us to publish it in 25,000 copies, which for a very young group in Italy is relatively difficult. And let's say that this is somehow the way in which we try to, let's say, to pursue our objectives, somehow trying to find a way to let it go through. Another important element to mention is the fact that we still work in one of the most difficult countries where to work as architects. Italy has the highest percentage of architects per, let's say, 1,000 inhabitants, as you can see in this diagram. And so this is the reason why some of the members had to move out of Italy. So this is more or less how a normal meeting would work. Here we are with some friends and former colleagues, and the two in the screen is the two of us. Because we are currently displaced all over Europe. Two of us are in Rotterdam, two in Milan, one in Hamburg. And this is all of us. And as you can clearly see, this image is a photo montage because we never have the chance to coincide in places. So let's say that the theme of the home is something that have been part of Fosbury discourse. We started through competition, as most people do, and this was one entry for like a competition that we did for Leeuwarden in the Netherlands. But what was interesting for us is to look at the city through the domestic. The task was to propose a urban strategy, and we did a urban strategy starting from literally dissecting the domestic space. And let's say that this consolidated somehow in a vision that is eventually a drawing. And the drawing is somehow a tool that we use as let's say, in order to build a common ground for every member of the collective to give a part in the design. Another instrument that we often use, and you will see it afterwards in the short explanation of the house that we did, we tend to work through taxonomies or collecting a lot of references in order to make a common ground. This is a project that we did some years ago for that is called Environments of Resistance, and basically tries to dissect once again the domestic, looking for this in-between scale that is neither a space nor an object. And we tried in our own way to reinterpret these elements, eventually responding to the same drawings that we did previously, so in a sort of hypertext, while one work called back to the other. And finally, another important component that we often need to have in order to work and produce work is to structure together a narrative. And in order to do that, well, this is an installation that we did in Chicago, actually, where we met all together with Jack. And the theme of the installation was to dissect the milieu of the video bloggers and YouTubers. And we tried to do that by, let's say, describing the room of a YouTuber. In order to structure a narrative, what we did is like to take on the one hand cultural references and on the other to build for us somebody to refer to. In our case was a very young video blogger that was struggling and was seeing like more famous ones as the PewDiePie that you can see here as like an aspirational figure. So the way in which we operated once again was to infill the drawings with all a series of memorabilia that were meant to describe the personality of our character, and that eventually were spread through the entire room. So going to the exercise that we were doing here, somehow it was very refreshing and interesting to look more, to have such a precise brief. Because often when you are, let's say, you are not really looking at some specific data as we were doing in this case. It was really surprising to notice how challenging it would have been, this exercise, by looking at how the surface of the average home in Britain have been drastically diminishing, and also the house had to accommodate in between was supposed to host the average amount of people that are present in the home, that could vary between 2 and 3 people. So we tried to translate this sort of brief into a very simple one. So this was the average scale, the amount of people that we had to fulfill, and the number of rooms that we had to have. And this eventually had to be translated in a design that, as you can see, as you will see later on, is not as linear as you would expect, because these are very radical data to process. On the other hand, what we try to do is, as working in a collective, we try to collect some references that we could use in order to understand the context. So Jack gave us a very precise, let's say, time frame of references to look into, so in between the 50s and the 80s. So what we try to do is to look into examples and derive some elements like the chimney. And here you can see a confrontation between our footprint and the footprint of this house, or some other more, let's say, some other details, such as the boiserie and the view towards the garden, or eventually the free plan, which is, let's say, the base on which we started to work. And always trying to, let's say, find this scale that is in between space and room, because it was so challenging to put these 5 rooms in the space that we had to somehow work it out in our classical way. And as we always work, we try to also interpret cliches. So what you will see as some sort of flamboyant component of the design is in fact our personal translation of it. So now we'll our design. So the house is defined by this sort of free plan, and both the rooms and let's say the service units, that are the kitchen and the bathroom, are basically simplified into the smallest, let's say, area that you could have. So you have basically 2 alcoves. One is a double bedroom and one is a single bedroom. And basically they are meant to serve either for a couple with the children or for 2 housemates. On the other hand, we concentrated the 2 services in some very defined elements in order to liberate the space as much as we could, in order to somehow respond to this 4.8 rooms per house. Whereas the elements of the continuous boiserie that runs through the house was used in order to accommodate all what could not be located inside the room per se, that were, let's say, the most frugal possible. So, as you can see, all these elements can somehow almost work and perform like by themselves. Everyone has his own skylight, and you can simply wander through the house from the backyard to the front door. And somehow the relationship between the domestic and this space is very much represented by this image that was chosen by Jack and Liam from Real Foundation, that somehow, let's say, in one single image, simply, let's say, synthesize the aim of our efforts, so to combine these two dimensions. On the one hand, the single space for the inhabitants, and on the other, the continuous space of the house. And yeah, this is another nice image that they produce, and that's it.
End on the pretty image. Does it have the timer? No. Go on. Just check on it. No, it's working. Oh yeah, it's all okay. Great. Hi. So I'm the returning one, coming back to the BSR after 4 years. It's a pleasure. A bit of a sort of personal story, beginning with my tongue, fitting into the sort of narrative of the overall program that Marina's put together of like kind of contemporary modes of practice and what's the role of the architect. I studied from 2002 to 2008 at the Architectural Association, where I was surrounded by lots of architects doing parametric architecture that looked like alien squids, which was mostly black, and they were mostly wearing black, and people were mostly looking very sad. That's Patrick Schumacher looking very sad in front there, wearing black in front of black parametric models. And so, you know, that was something that didn't necessarily fit me, and I was very, very excited about leaving the Architectural Association in 2008 and going out into the wide, colourful world and building lots of buildings. And you know, people, colleagues of mine or friends of mine from university had been leaving and building skyscrapers 2 years after graduating because it was the boom time. You know, as you go to Dubai and do a giant, or Abu Dhabi, and do a giant Ferrari exhibition space. However, a couple of months after I graduated, the world ended. Lehman Brothers collapsed. The financial system as we know it ended. We had the first bank failure in British history since the, 1980s, but a major one since the 19th century. And there were no jobs. And I think I applied to over 50 practices and didn't get a position. This was not unusual. I was like many, many other graduates, as I've now found out, in Italy as well as in England. And there was a kind of very large discussion in the UK of like, what on earth do? We've graduated and we have all this energy and all this excitement, and we don't have any money, we don't have any jobs, but we want to change the world. And a model and a sort of mode of working that a lot of people kind of took to is the collective. So a lot of people got together, they had other jobs at the time, but they would come together with, they'd sort of create their own projects. Obviously this is Assemble, the amazing team. However, that unfortunately was not something I could fit myself into. My interest was slightly different to all of my kind of fellow colleagues who were graduating at the same time. I was interested in the kind of experiences I'd had in the gay scene in London. The kind of interiors that really fascinated me were more to do with drag and expression and identity and colour and camp, and you know, that doesn't really fit into that sort of milieu. So I had a little bit, and you know, I had a lot of friends from that sort of world, but I couldn't really fit in. So I felt a little bit sort of sad and like, you know, no, like, I don't really do the things that the other cool kids are doing, but like, I can't do anything else because actually I do really bad. If I try and do what they do, I do it really badly, so there's no point in doing it. And so there's a bit of dejection, and there's a bit of like, oh, screw this architecture scene. It's all superficial. You know, the fact that they reject aesthetics is actually an aesthetic decision in itself. So I felt a little bit cynical, and I still am very cynical about the way people conform to specific types of aesthetics to fit in architecture, certain types of drawing, certain types of minimalism. And at a certain point when I sort of started to see the subjective nature of all of these decisions, I sort of went, well, screw it, I'm just going to come out the architectural closet. So I was like, I stopped sort of trying to be like all of my friends who were doing amazing work, and I just went, well, you know what, okay, I'm going to come out. And, you know, in particularly the world of social media that was evolving at the time, that was not the greatest decision. It felt a bit like this for a while, with, you know, like certain figures on the internet, not really thinking thinking that I was being contrarian. I was just wanting to get attention and piss people off, but actually I just wanted to sort of explore the issues that I liked in architecture. And there's a kind of long history of this in sort of queer aesthetics and queer expression, which is sort of relegated to the domestic environment. It's been relegated to private spaces and private spheres. It cannot show itself in the city. It can't show itself in public. And the only time it could show itself in public was either kind of hiding itself in plain sight, or this is an example, a principle explained by Graham Robb in his book Strangers about 19th century queer culture, minstrelization. So like in the court of the king, there'd be the minstrel who danced around and act like an idiot, and he was sort of accepted because as the idiot, because he sort of fit a particular role. And sort of queer people in a lot of Western cultures have been allowed to express themselves publicly if they fit a sort of non-threatening, hilarious, fun model. Like in Britain, we have a lot of television presenters who sort of make lots of lewd jokes, like, ew, nice bum. And they were allowed to sort of be queer in public if they were non-threatening in that way. So I was like, no, I don't want to do that either. And so at a certain point, sort of, I said, I'm just going to get rid of the idea of being a sort of over-theatrical drag version of myself to try and fit in. And I also don't necessarily want to be a traditional architect. That sounds like a decision. It was more because I just couldn't get a job, so I had to do that. And started to produce work which I felt really expressed the ideas that I was interested in, which there's a lot of political aspects to it, but they're always expressed aesthetically. They're always expressed, let me check if I'm doing okay for time, yep. They're always expressed very viscerally, visually, through colour, in a way that's non-intellectual and can be understood without having an explanation. So I think you get the point of what that is, even though there's a story behind it. And the way of sort of being able to produce work was kind of move slightly out of trying to get jobs or to get sort of practical architectural projects, and for instance to get residencies. So this was a project produced for the Design Museum, where they have a residency program which is more sort of to do with design/art, which was a sphere where I found that people were much more accepting and willing to discuss issues that I wanted to, that the architectural sort of the straight architectural world wasn't necessarily comfortable with. So this is a project produced for the Design Museum with their financial support and exhibited in the Design Museum, exploring issues of identity for the contemporary designer in relation to contemporary politics, social media, technology, loneliness, and also material fabrication. These are all 3D printed. And that's me with clothing to fit my work. Oh, yes. So this has meant also that, so I must mention that eventually I did get a job. And so I had some fantastic bosses in some quite famous practices who basically funded me to do all of these things on the side. And while I couldn't get architectural commissions for a long time, I was sort of producing or pieces of design that would very often be considered like not serious, or from the world of like queer designers, or effeminate, whether it be textiles, little objects for the house or furniture, and treating each one as a little architectural manifesto. So looking at architectural issues, but through the projects that I was actually able to do in the way that I wanted to. I think you can possibly tell that there's some multiple imagery going on here in relation to the body. And similarly, exploring the same issues now that I'm starting to get more commissions. So eventually I did actually start to get more substantial work and was able to leave these wonderful practices that were supporting me, who didn't mind me falling asleep during the day because I was doing all these things in the evening. And in these interior projects, I'm exploring the same sort of questions. So on the surface, there's this kind of like easy aesthetic comprehensibility. There's a sense of pleasure and joy and exuberance. But just like with Andy Warhol and all of his sort of explorations of commercial culture and consumer culture, there's a kind of quite acidic cynicism, anger, criticism going on beneath all of my work. Obviously, this is just Warhol's Crash series, which I think sort of underlies his relationship to the material that he was always showing. And similarly, I'm always sort of trying to make points sort of insidiously in my work, critiquing various things. This is a collection of furniture that I made just after I came back from Rome, and it's sort of looking at these fascist architectural tropes and forms which are very popular in Britain. Well, fascist is from the period of the 1930s in Italy, but there is never discussion about the kind of cultural context that it comes from, and if there is a discussion, it's a little bit too like extreme, and so I sort of took these forms and I said, okay, they're from the fascist period, and I dragged them, and I said it's a little bit like, you know, putting lipstick on a pig. It's lipstick on Mussolini, but just being upfront about the material that it was dealing with with. And through all of this, it's the way I work with my material is like taking standard things, cliches, which is something that I know that Fosbury is interested in because it's something that everyone understands. In this case, classical architecture and classical forms, which have a tradition nonetheless throughout history as being used by queer culture and alternative cultures as a way of hiding in plain sight. So they multiply code. Examples of, I think there's Catholic Church, Saint Sebastian, who has kind of been continuously like a gay icon before Madonna was a gay icon for a very long time. Back to, Winckelmann coming to Rome and finding the sensuality of white male representations in classical architecture as a way of him being effectively homosexual in plain sight and actually being lauded and celebrated for it. And classical architecture and classical language has this sort of tradition of being doubly coded, as being queer and totally acceptable at the same time, as well as being adopted by fascist and totalitarian regimes. So there's kind of this simultaneous recoding of architectural languages from both ends. And that's something that I explored when I came to the BSR, and I did a project here where I was sort of reinterpreting the architectures of Rome through my own queer lens. So sort of like rehashing and mixing popular cultural references from stories of Rome's recent history with its fascist architectural past, its republican past before that, and going back to when it was a papal state, and combining these and turning them all into souvenirs. So always looking at cliches and things that kind of emotively convey content. I'm going to have to flip through this because I'm just at the end of my thing. So, and again, it's just examples of things that I've done in the UK. This is recoding of classical architecture in a way that really pisses off or annoys the sort of more right-wing elements who claim that classical architecture is belongs to European white civilization, whatever that is. This is something I produced for Jacopo, who's in the front row, which similarly looks at kind of classical form in a grander way. I do this also with it might remind you of certain French cathedrals, but recoding it for contemporary society. I also I sort of continuously have been active in activism in public realms through, in sort of public environments and forums in a very sort of like over-the-top and expressive way, arguing for sort of queer aesthetics in public space, and also maybe some of you might know on Instagram, kind of like producing a lot of memes that are relatively hard-hitting. It's a bit like attacking an issue with a sledgehammer from my perspective. Just ending on the fact that domestic environments are always super important for me, but also for queer history, also in feminist history. They are the spaces where you have been able to create your own environment separate to capitalist society, paternalist society, and express your own individual or small communal identity in a way that was separate to like the imposing normalization of culture around you. From the closet, where you could construct your own identity through clothes, through to the space around you where you could do it through design. Just some other examples, and concluding with the exhibition outside, which is doing the same thing, creating an atmosphere from cliches and pop cultural examples from movies of Italian representations of Italian and British domestic environments in the time frame laid out by Jack. These were some of the sort of haphazard examples that I collected. Jack and Liam at Real Foundation systematically and scientifically and amazingly went through and found very specific comparative examples from the two cultures, and I think it was Italian directors making films about Britain, British directors making films about Italy, and then selected colours from that, which we turned into this immersive environment to contain their beautiful architectural investigations. I have some merchandise with some sexy things on it if you want to buy some off the internet. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for your presentation. And I think it's a very nice occasion, this one. It's a very nice occasion to given a different generation between me and you, and given an architecture, I think, and you think, is under pressure nowadays for different reasons. I think it's a very nice moment to start. I would like to make some question about what do you think about the role of the architect and architecture nowadays, because in a different way you challenge the traditional role of architect, or the architect. So I think I want to know how you see this. So I will start making some questions. I will start with Jack. So Jack, you defend the position of being against but within. Yes, that's a very interesting position. And if I see, because I look at all your website, and look at real, you start say, what does it mean to live today? Or you design model of ownership, different model of ownership. For example, in Ingot, you propose complex financial algorithm, very difficult. I tried to understand what was very difficult, that manipulates condition to the debt, and on another project, you make people free from mortgage, want to free people from mortgage, etc., etc. So it looks like that you really put yourself in between inside and outside, and you want to deal with something that usually are not in the matter of architect, is not in what the architects do. And my first question was, it's a very honest question, say, do we need an architect to do this? Do we need an architect to design a mortgage, design a model of ownership? So are you still within, or you're just against? So what does it mean for you? What does it mean for you to be an architect today, being within but against? Don't just an economist was enough to design this model of ownership. Why an architect is better, or why we need an architect to do that instead of just beautiful house?
Well, I don't reject architects doing beautiful houses. That's really great. I would love to maybe do a beautiful house in the future. But to answer your question, I think the best way to say it is like this. The first thing is, the first ever piece of activism I was involved in was 2001 in the protest against the war in Iraq. Oh no, it must have been 2003 or 2. And the last piece of activism I was involved in was, I was quite involved in the Occupy London Stock Exchange movement in 2011. And this was the last time where I really felt like it was possible to pressure people in positions of power to change their opinion based on public activism. So I know it had already been declining through the late 1990s and early 2000s, but in a way the failure of the Occupy movement to create any significant change showed me that I don't make this as a universal statement, because activism now exists in different forms. But for me, as an architect, it was not a good use of my time to be on the streets, because basically politicians especially have no shame. You can't shame them into resigning. You can't shame them into doing anything. No one has a sense of a civic space anymore. And so that leads me to the second part of the question, which is, do we need architects to be doing all of these different things? Well, in an ideal world, it would be a continuation of social housing policies from the post-war era. I mentioned before that there was only really, I don't mean to be nostalgic about it, because also a very problematic era, but just from an architectural standpoint, this is one of the, really almost the only times in history when the state directly asked the architect to think of things like typical housing. Before this, it was not a generalized program. And there was amazing architects in Britain who worked for the London County Council. And in 1950, the LCC was the largest architecture office in the world. And now it's SOM. But in a way, the conclusion there is like, I would have loved to be an anonymous architect just really try to do good housing at large scale, because this, I think, is something I want to do with my life and what I believe in. That's not possible. Therefore, I have to try and create conditions in which that is possible. So all of the discussion about economics and finance is in the end just a way to get into a position to be able to do something that I would like to do anyway. And that means that I know very well that to motivate people in a particular way, I feel quite free in this audience, because in an institutional context you can speak freely about things. When I have meetings with the Mayor's office or with the Greater London Authority, I have to phrase things in a way that talks about policy, planning. When I talk to financiers or developers or people involved in the financial markets, I have to talk about return on equity and investment and understand all of the financial concepts. And then when I talk to people like my mom, who I consider to be the perfect example of the general public, she's an intelligent woman, and she's open to architecture, she's open to being interested in it, she knows a little bit about it, but she's not fascinated by it. So if you can convince her that this is something which is important and which she can engage with, then I feel that you can really talk to anyone about it. And so in that sense, the way that you talk about architecture or the home to the general public is also, again, another type of voice, let's say. So I believe very much in cultivating these different facets of how you communicate in order to arrive at your objective. But the problem with being against from within, in my opinion, if you imagine the Trojan horse, is that it's very easy for the soldiers who are inside the Trojan horse to get inside Troy and go like, actually, it's really nice here. You know, people are nice, lifestyle's good, weather's great. Yeah, and it's often the case that you see people who are very radical when they're young, and as they get older, of course, they become comfortable, they become implicated in systems of society which are impossible to resist, like debt, like mortgages, like marriage, which I love. I'm married 2 years now, and I mean, touch wood, it continues. But in a way, the question is, how do you preserve that essence? How do you preserve that spirit which you have when you're young to change the world as you get older? And I think this is, I would say, central to all of our practice.
Yes, and so I answer to you doing the next question to Fosbury. When you talk about, because it's more or less there are some similarities, Nathan is a little different, but when you talk about project of resistance, and you make environments of resistance, and you design that against capitalism, against globalization, against IKEA, blah, blah, blah. And I understand very well. But then, going back to architecture, when you did a project that was for the Biennale in Muro? Yes. Muro, you propose a deliberate abandonment. So you make a big wall, and then you just abandon, in a way. So my question is to you, and also is a kind of answer to him. Do you think that architecture in itself can have the instruments, the tools, the voice to fight what you're looking for, to resist? Because in history, I think, if you look back, very back, you see that architecture has always been asked by a power. Was the Pope, was the King, was the socialism, capitalism. I mean, it's the history of architecture, it's also history of art, in a way. So history is also, in architecture is also answered to that with its instrument, with its tool, with the space. For example, the Smithson, when they did The Economist, it was for them a project of resistance. So I ask you, why when you do, how you translate your idea of resistance and you do in your small environments, kind of Sotsa's way of doing that, how you translate this idea of resistance in architecture?
Well, somehow we consider those environments as architecture, in a way. In the sense that, let's say, if you would consider all this research that we left more or less at the stage of research, because we did try to do some prototypes or apply them as strategies in urban spaces, but somehow since they oppose the generic space that is produced by the lack of privacy, like all what threatens the domestic, somehow those are spaces expressions of resistance to all this flattening that architecture is doing. And what we always try to do, and this is also the case of Muro, is to first of all derive the premises of our projects by reading reality. So that's why we consider those environments, for instance, as an antidote to this sort of generic space. That research started with by looking at, on the one hand, in a competition to the abandoned spaces that had to be reused, and on the other, by looking at what Airbnb and sharing was producing on let's say, the home. And IKEA is, once again, a very powerful instrument of uniformity for interiors. Going back to the premise, so we do consider those little furniture as architectures because they perform as spaces. So we do not really make a difference between something that is built or something that is an interior per se, if it performs, if it's space making. On the other hand, while we go to look into urban strategy or visions, once again, what we were doing there is it was a very complicated context to deal with. I mean, it's an industrial area. You don't really know what to do with that because you would never have the money and the resources to, let's say, make it come back to a status that will make it be taken over by the city. So in that case, it's better to make a fence and find another function for it. Basically, once again, subverting a little bit the elements instead of trying to. This was a vision, not something that we proposed to a municipality as Jack does. So this somehow may put us in a space that is slightly different. Yet, let's say that pragmatism, more or less, is something that is a common thing in both of these two projects, even if they are at very different scale.
Yes, I understand that your environment's a small architecture, but as Jack was saying, when you deal with architecture, you deal with very also tough arguments like the request, the money, the finance, a lot of matters that really are very strong role in architecture. I mean, can have. So the resistance there is also stronger, if possible. You want to tell something? Yes. So I understand your answer that this environment is a small architecture, even if my question was, if you have to deal with architecture, the resistance is against but within, or then we go to Adam with another question, or?
Just a very quick kind of thing, which is about what is the meaning of architecture, right? Yeah. And there are many ways to talk about it, but I don't want to go into a long one. But one thing which is interesting in Italian that you make a distinction that you don't make in English. So I often use, I would describe them as European words rather than English words for certain things in the office because they're superior to English concepts. So for example, we don't talk about, in English you have model for both basically a system and also for a maquette. But this is very confusing because if someone starts talking about a model in the office, it's like, are you talking about a business model, like a financial model? And then they're like, yes, but then it turns out how, you're making a 1 to 100 business model? I mean, what does this mean? So we're very clear, there are maquettes and there are models, but also there are projects and there are works. So you say in English, in Italian, I think, progetti and opera. Is this right?
No, we call them progetti.
All of them are progetti? Because sometimes you see on Italian websites the distinction. Well, no, for me they're all projects because the essence of architecture is the project, which basically means type of imagination, a type of proposition, and it can be very critical, it can be very deconstructed, it can be very angry, but in the end you always make a proposition. You make a proposal for what the world will be. And then to bring it back to maybe to directly your question, it's like, okay, well, yes, we are agents of power, so we get asked to do different things at different times. And now we live in a time when the state and civic society has said, there are no jobs, there is no money, we don't really care about what you do. It's up to you. The responsibility is on you to decide what you have to do. And therefore, the responses you see are what happens when an individual decides what they want to do. And that becomes, in a way, part of architecture, I think. Anyway.
Thank you. Then, Adam, which are the more original way. I mean, if you see your website, you sell bags and phone case, and I mean, you're kind of shop and firm and office, and you're very atypical as a traditional architect. So, what do you think the architect has to be today? What is the scope of his work for you?
Well, first of all, I'd say that probably they're even more atypical, but I guess I'm sort of instantaneously, visually, more obviously slightly different. But I mean, there is no way to be an architect, no. I mean, what drew me to the profession in the first place was, on the one hand, it seemed like a profession that was extremely diverse with lots of modes of practice, and it was also a profession that it seemed that you died still learning when you were 95, which is, so it's like two things that really excited me about it. I then sort of went into the profession and realized that the kind of the professionalization of it in the UK, I'm not sure about here, from the 1950s onwards, of the creation of like Part 3, with these gatekeepers who control what the boundaries of the profession are, does make it very limiting. So I guess when I talk about architecture and I talk about the role of the architect, I imagine the kind of broader field of people working in spatial practices. But architectural training, university training, does teach you quite well to think at all scales. So I do like to think of architects as people who can operate at all those scales. So there's no one way to be, but I do feel that there's a kind of constant tendency to narrow what is acceptable to be as an architect, and one does have to kind of socially constantly sort of push at every generation to reopen it a little bit. But yeah, on the one hand, I don't think I have a very unusual form of practice, and I think the profession actually traditionally does have scope for people like me.
Yes, this is also an Italian model we call from spoon to the city, in a way. So now I want to ask you something about relation about architecture and form and aesthetic. Because in a way you deal differently with this topic, and I think it's a matter of architecture as well to understand how you as an architect, you position yourself in this argument. So starting again with Jack, I see that you look for generic and anonymous. For example, the grey building is kind of free, again, is a way I understand very clearly, conceptually speaking, why you are so interested in generic. Because generic, in a way, free the building from the form, and in a way is a way of looking for freedom. And you also, in the grey building, which I think is the one that you showed today. Same series. Yeah, it's a series. You want to free people from form, from control, from mortgage, etc. Do you think that, this is my question, it really is an important question, do you think that is enough to free people from mortgage and control and form, to be people happy? I mean, in the building you do. I mean, what is about, what we are talking about when we do in architecture, we are working for people, I think. No, I think, that's for sure. And I think that one of the most important things is to create space and house or office or city, I would like to talk about the city as well, where people can be happy or make the life for the people better than before. And ownership, free people from mortgages, for sure, one piece of this history. But are you sure that this is a really serious question, are you sure that a generic grey building, anonymous everywhere in the world, can do that?
No, not at all. And I think the aesthetic and form of the house which I present here for Mean Home is very much more in line with how I'm trying to practice, which is I used to say that form follows finance, but of course finance in itself is not enough to give you form, and then there become many other questions, right? But at a basic level, I mean, I don't know about happiness. I don't know if I'm quite happy.
No, but let's make people live better.
Yeah, so, but I mean, well, it's an interesting point though, because of course, these days many people are interested in happiness, but I honestly don't think that, for example, for my grandfather, I don't think that happiness was an object of his life. I think his generation had a... Yes. Well, this is part of, let's say, because, of course, we're in Rome, which is the heart of a great civilization, which didn't believe in progress. So, I mean, it's debatable, but ancient Rome did not have the concept of progress that we have today. So they did not believe that technology gets better, that society gets better, that we become more moral, more improved beings with every generation. Then you accept human civilization as it is. When I read Marcus Aurelius, or I don't know how you call him in Italian, Marco Aurelio, you read that, it's for me extremely contemporary, even though it's more than 2,000 years old, right? And so basically, if you assume that humanity is stable, then you have periods of better condition and periods of worse condition. What do I want to do? I want to improve the condition. And I believe that when it comes to housing, it's a complicated question, and I try to be very rapid about it. But of course, Marx and Engels, I don't identify with any political identity because it becomes very problematic. But let's say I have quite progressive views when it comes to the role of the material built environment. Marx and Engels, well, Engels in the housing question says you cannot have socialist housing in advance of a proletariat revolution, because he says if you do this, what you end up creating is just better houses for the working class. So therefore the worker is better rested and they feel more dedicated to the factory, right? So this is the problem. So then the question is, but I, on the other hand, I don't really believe in revolution. I don't know if it is possible in the same way anymore, but also I don't like violence. And also it's not the spirit of the architect. The architect has very long time to think about projects. Well, no, you work very quickly on projects, but you have a long time to work, which means that the scale of our buildings, which might last for 50 or 60 years, are very different from other modes of artistic practice. And therefore, I don't think the revolution is necessarily relevant to architecture. And what I'm trying to do is create a space from inside the existing, which can point towards a different type of society. And I'm worried because it may not be enough. I don't know. But then when you look at the type of house I've designed here, it's very banal things, which is, so the question of form and aesthetic is on the one hand something that everyone recognizes.
But also, I mean, form aesthetic as space, material.
Yes, exactly. So space, exactly. So this house which I've designed on the one hand is very banal. It, let's say, looks like a house, has a roof that we all recognize as a house, has a chimney, which is now actually the oculus in the dome. It resembles something that we find familiar, but actually in terms of the spaces themselves, they are not the types of spaces that you find in existing homes. They don't have functional preconditions, and this comes ultimately to an idea that maybe you can't make society free through the house, but you can prevent society from repeating structures that existed in previous generations. For me, ultimately, it should always be a choice, which is to say, the relationship you have with other people, the structure that you have with other people, the structure of society, all of these things, if we can enter into those structures, clearly understanding what they are and accepting that there is a good relationship or it's a valid relationship, that's fine. But the problem is that we inherit so much from our previous generations. We inherit ideas about how we should behave, ideas about what we can say, ideas about what is good taste and bad taste, what is acceptable and what is not, what is forbidden and what is pleasurable. And in a way, I would like very much, I believe very much, and of course we inherit most of all the built environment. We inherit the monuments and the houses of previous generation, and therefore you live in the ideology of the past. And in that sense, what I want to make now is something which in 50 or 60 years will still be able to be made contemporary, will still be able to adapt to changing values, and indeed even make possible greater change as a result of the freedom that comes through space. And it's a modest ambition, but it's also maybe the only thing I think architects can actually achieve.
I understand. So generic generic is a way of ensure to architecture the possibility of changing, of adapting, of repeating. Yes. Okay, so this is a very long discourse.
Yes.
It's a very long discourse. I would like to jump to Adam, which is a different and opposite way of dealing with this form. You wrote a book about postmodernism with Terry Farrell, and you say there's a new formal agenda. I don't remember exactly the phrase. There's a new formal agenda. So. And I mean, if you look your genealogy, it's very clear. You also declare about Memphis, so there's a very clear identity in the aesthetic that you choose. But I wonder two things. One is Memphis was playful, colorful, okay, but was also a protest against what was the so-called good design, very perfect and black and white, blah blah. So the form, in the sense it was a kind of revolution, was a protest. And the second thing is about style. Do you think that nowadays we really need a new formal agenda for a new style? Don't we have too many styles? Don't we have too many noisy architecture and spectacular? So what's your position about this?
I mean, regarding Memphis, I refer to them because that's what everyone knows. So if I refer to other examples, it's like people don't know them very much. But yeah, Memphis was very yeah. I mean, because it's a reference that people are aware of, particularly in Italy. But they were very radical, and they had a very specific agenda. No, well, okay, it was framed as a very specific agenda.
I mean, they had it
post-mortem by Barbara.
kind of agenda.
Yeah.
And they were very free in the forum, but the agenda was quite clear at the moment. It was kind of, no? So.
Yeah. Yeah, and there was, they also weren't intended to last. Like, it was a sort of experiment, which worked very effectively, and then sort of disbanded quite rapidly. But it still has consequences to this day. Like, their effects on form have continued without the content, and those have been endlessly regurgitated. But then that's not unusual. Everything that gets produced, even if it's Labix or David Chipperfield, gets endlessly regurgitated nowadays, as Jack was talking about earlier. So that's not unique to them. It's just that theirs stands out more and gets labelled. But in terms of style. I mean, I guess the thing is, I think there's a 19th century way of seeing style as a kind of like very constructed embodiment of a set of values for a particular place and time by a group of people, which are embodied aesthetically and are agreed upon by multiple people. And I don't agree with that, because my interest is, and you were talking about like, should we design to make people happy? I don't know what happiness is. I think happiness is the absence of fear and the absence of discomfort and worry. So I don't know about happiness, but I think my interest is in designing spaces of exception and places of exception and aesthetics for exceptions and people who like to construct their own. And what I would say here is style in a kind of classical liberal sense. So not a kind of communal nationalist project that defines, like, you know, I don't know, Slovenia's reinvention of its identity or Germany's construction of its own national identity that never existed in the 19th century. Rather, it's like the individual pursuit of expression through something that is defined as style more along the lines of fashion. So it's an embodiment of your identity at a given point in time through an aesthetic externalization of your own values. And this can also be the same for a group. So that's having style, right? It's not a Gottfried Semper style. It's having style. So there's a kind of more classical liberal idea of like what that might mean and how that can be used radically. And like you have protest groups who construct their own styles, and they're not like treatises. Right? They're not theoretical tracts explaining why the style should represent a particular nation, but they do embody quite viscerally, they make real the political ideals of a group at a particular point in time. So I guess that's the kind of style that I'm interested in, if that makes sense.
Yes, makes sense. I was very curious because we wrote this book on postmodernism, which was kind of very, in a way, nowadays, writing a book about postmodernism because it was a year ago or 2 years ago that was issued. 2 years ago. Well, it's okay. So it was was very curious to me that someone decide to do a book on postmodernism that, I mean, is conceived, globally speaking, something that is super, that is kind of old and old-fashioned and something else. So I said, this is interesting that someone decided, it's very young, decided to do a book about postmodernism and agendas, because this was kind of your introduction or phrase in the book. So this was curious to me, was say, what was behind that? That was my curiosity. That was really my curiosity about that, because making a book about postmodernism and about the style of because it was all about the form and the style, was a curiosity. To me, it was kind of very curious. That's why the question was to you, understanding better what was behind this choice. If you just very briefly.
So I tried to make the point in the book that it wasn't a style, and that actually it's a sort of label given to a particular period in time, which, because it sort of got, this happens with critics, they tend to sort of label kind of quite diverse movements from a particular period of time with a name, and they own it and they phrase it, and they sort of give it a sort of terminology and a framework which belongs to them, whether it's Charles Jenks or one particular academic architect like Venturi, but there was a lot of other things going on at the time. So I guess the point I was trying to unravel in the book was that it was an extremely diverse period that I see as being an extension of modernism, or like a revivification of modernism, like the mode of how one expresses the catastrophic changes in society which are happening at a given point in time, and how they can be embodied in space and how they can be embodied visually, stylistically and aesthetically as something that fits the times. And that's not red pediments sitting on blue columns. So the whole point of the book was that I actually was trying to open that up a little bit. And the reason that I was drawn to it was that I was at university surrounded by lots of Patrick Schumachers, either Patrick Schumachers or sort of like, Caruso St. John, like, oh, the concrete kind of people. And which was, they all do really nice architecture. But like I was wanting to look at architecture that expressed identity, that expressed history, alternative forms of history, that was radical in a way that like fit the kind of culture that I came from, which was exuberantly expressive and embodied through like radically and constantly changing visual manifestations, and it simply wasn't allowed. And so looking back, there were several periods where this occurred, but postmodernism, it's basically the period from the 1960s until the late 1970s, was when architects like from 1900 to like 1915, in sort of early modernism, when there's an explosion of aesthetics embodying quite radical ideas, trying to express what the hell this modernity was. There are architects exploring this issue from like, feminist queer aesthetics, like alternative ways of living. It was really, really exciting. And it wasn't just like models in terms of like financial models, but it was also like, what does it look like? And that was all not allowed to be looked at in the academy. So in the university, I was not allowed to discuss any of it. I was not allowed to research it. I was not allowed to write essays on it. And so it wasn't like yay, postmodernism. It was like, can we actually just be allowed to research bits of history objectively, without just sort of having some sort of visceral emotional response to them that stops us using them as part of our historiography, which is what was happening at the time.
Okay, thank you. The question after the question. So, no, let me finish. And I want to talk about Fosbury also. I had the same question. So your generation, in different way, looks very strongly something about, for example, you say we do everything, but we don't do what the market asks. Or we say we do, you wrote on your website, so you say we don't do what the market asks. So the first question is, the market, what is the market? Everyone is the market, the single home. And the second question is, we are for ethic, less for aesthetic. But then, that's the second point, they say, okay, this is kind of something that look like ideology, but then when you see your drawings, when you see how you present yourself, what you do, there is a very strong aesthetic in the way you present yourself. So there is something that I want, there is a kind of ideology, I think aesthetic, the market, and then while you research, you look for, I think correctly, you look for an aesthetic. So I want to understand better, what's the market for you? Why this, the architecture has to deal with the market in a way, Jack does in a way, he does in another way. So what's this mean?
Okay. difficult question. Huh? But let's say that first of all, as I was trying to explain earlier, we decided to keep as much as we could the form of a collective, so which entails discussion somehow. So from an aesthetic point of view, answering the second question first, we tend to be quite omnivorous in whatever we look at, and we take whatever we want if it fits the, let's say, agenda that we give ourselves towards the project. So basically, by trying to practice in a context that is not somehow helping, giving a lot of space to people to practice, especially young architects. Actually, our first project were an investigation on what is the condition of the young architect. We didn't present it today, but the very first one was Potlatch, that was literally a call for drawings of other people. And somehow also the aesthetic that is embedded to it. I mean, everybody back then was starting to do line drawings, and the line drawing was somehow it's something that it takes a lot of time to be done, yet it's something that the practice would ask you as a student doing an internship or as a young architect in a firm. So basically, we saw a connection in between this aesthetic and, let's say, the market, so what the market was asking. So in that sense, we always tried somehow to adapt. We are quite an opportunistic practice, so we try to, let's say, move on a path that is defined by what we managed to do, as most of people, and we are very honest in saying that. And on the other hand, we try per project to to make this project becoming meaningful, whatever it is. I mean, there are our first commission that never happened was a pizzeria in Ibiza. Never got built, but fantastic. So in any case, you tend to, and whatever it is, either it's a book or it's whatever type of commission, you try to make it meaningful, because somehow we are not yet in a position in which this is profitable. The moment in which we would, probably the moment in which this organization would become properly profitable, we would have to change a little bit the structure. So you divide the time in a different way. So let's say, since we work in this very...
We don't do one when the market asks if the pizzeria in Ibiza is a market. I found it completely right. So I just want to understand if there is a cohesion between the words and the fact. I mean,
yes, no, I understand. The thing is that what we try...
That's what I mean. It's the way you do that makes a difference. No?
Yes, no, I understand. But what we try to do always is to use every project that we do as a pretext to understand to have an understanding of what we are doing, to derive a knowledge. I mean, we are a big amount of people, so in a way, let's say before a pizzeria in Ibiza becomes profitable, we really need to make a lot of pizzerias, or it's a very big one.
Maybe a series of pizzeria with Jack. So he makes a financial model of a pizzeria.
No, but I think that what I really admire in his way of practicing is that he has a very specific and clear agenda, and it's something that it's really, I mean, we have found very difficult to, let's say, produce, whereas I think that having a clear agenda, as it does, will make you have a more linear path. On the other hand, if I have to say what could be good from our way of working, is that we have gathered a little bit of shared knowledge somehow. That is somehow our treasure, a little bit our treasure. That is something that we use and keep using and refining and getting a deeper understanding. The moment in which we will be able to define a precise agenda, we will probably perform better.
It's not a critic, huh? Was just a question. So as I know that in 15 minutes, no, in less than, what time is it? We have to leave the room. I will give the microphone to Simone or to any other question that is. So there are a lot of questions. So, now you want to?
There's a second.
There's a second microphone. Okay, better.
Maybe I can say something while we're waiting for the question. Yeah. So. Well, yes. No, well, I was going to say something about like having a very clearly defined objective, because it doesn't make for a more linear career. I mean, my career is still always like this, right? But actually, because I'm a godless man, I wouldn't go so far as to say atheist, because atheism it requires a lot of energy to justify, and it's very boring at dinner conversation. So let's just say I'm without God. However, I have a very good friend who is an Italian Catholic Marxist, which is a type of subjectivity which I admire very much, that you can be both quite a radical Marxist and also preserve a strong Christian faith. And I asked him about this. I asked him about faith, and I asked him what faith meant for him and how he sustained this, because I know he goes through periods where he doesn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God, or he goes through periods where he finds it very difficult to be part of the church. And he said that for him, faith was not really the same as belief, but faith is even doing the act even when you don't believe. So even if he didn't feel in the right mood, when he felt in a bad mood or he felt like he hated it, he still did it. And that for him was the essence of faith. And that, I think, in a way, let's say, if I have any faith, it is in this particular goal in the role of the architect, which is that some days I don't believe what I say, some days I really believe what I say, but every day I still do the same thing, and I try to do that.
I agree. This is the only way to do the architect, I think. Simone or whoever.
Thanks for your conversation. It's really interesting to us, also from the President conversation, how to see your the UK, the British, the UK.
Simone was the moderator for Assemble.
Exactly. So, yeah, but also the conversation with Luca.
With Finn Williams.
Yeah, was interesting too. So what is interesting to us is looking in the millennials, well, this generation of architects, also really involved in self-critique and also political issues and political arguments, but not from just an intellectual without any kind of no relationship with the real society. It's really interesting how, from my point of view, how you and Nathaniel presented your work and tried to motivate it. And also the president architects too. And it's interesting because also here in Italy we have the problem of how people are transforming the way of living into the houses, and how the young generation needs to break up with the present generation in order to destructure the everyday life, how we live, how we relate each other. So thanks for bringing back this issue to the substance of architecture. And from another point of view, I think that the discussion about postmodernism is something more to be faced from this kind of point of view. Instead, I think that it's it's seen again as a sort of style, the actual fashion of the moment. Because, for instance, you were very clear in, okay, we have changed this, we are having different kind of sexual behavioral approaches, and so we want that this kind of approaches are able to turn the society. While we are living in a society, it is spreading wars all around the boundary of Europe. In Ukraine, we have destroyed a lot of cities and a lot of heritage. In Syria, in Turkey, in Libya now, and so you can choose the country on the edge of Europe. They're destroyed by, and the cultural heritage we are losing cannot be reduced to postmodernism, because it's something to say, because we need to be respectful towards gender condition, we have also to be respectful towards cultural diversity of the world, because the biodiversity of our environment is also related to the biodiversity of our cultural condition of our cities. So I agree when we use this as a provocation in order to fight against gender restrictions. But sometimes, maybe because I'm Roman, and this is the problem, I know. But sometimes the factual values coming from the diversity of the world are part of this big picture you are reopening. And thanks to be here. So it's just a reflection, and I was really interested in this.
It's a reflection more than a question. But just pick. It's a very good reflection there. Well, thank you. Well, it's a lovely reflection. So picking up on that, would you say with some of the other architects in the program who share a lot of the same concerns, particularly in the last, well, you've sort of answered that already, Adam. Would you say you're a minority voice of your generation, or do you think you're reflecting some of the wider concerns of your generation?
A minority voice of a generation is an incredible phrase to apply to a man who is white, middle class, heterosexual, well-educated. I don't think I could claim to be a minority voice. But also, of course, when you hear this expression, minority voice of your generation, suddenly I have the impression that I'm going to be telling people in 2068, I'm going to be talking about 2011, the same way we talk about 1968 today. And immediately, like, the very phrase, the idea of minority voice of your generation, it's like, it's over, like, it's dead. It's done. No, I don't know. I mean, it's for me. I can't. Yeah.
This program is round around people like Assemble, Public Practice. Adam, you know, your work too, you, Fosbury, and it's sort of voicing very specific concerns and their shared concerns. How, put it this way, how many fellow architects, your generation, do you think share those concerns? Do you prefer that question?
Yeah, it's becoming more mainstream. It's becoming more. When we started our work in the late 2000s and early 2010s, it was extremely rare. I mean, my project, when I present my project for a gold building at the Architectural Association, which is a school which doesn't know anything really about architecture. Everything is architecture. You can do a performance of someone crying inside a box in a room where no one is watching them for 3 hours and graduate as an architect. So they have a very expanded definition of what constitutes architecture in the most beautiful way. And when I present them with the idea of a financial algorithm that would allow to create low-cost housing in the center of the city, they said, well, you've designed a gold building. And I said, no, the gold building is one example of an algorithm which can be applied to any corner of the city, and it will tell you wherever you go exactly what the volume of the building should be in order to achieve these conditions. And they fundamentally, this also is a school which invent parametricism, and they fundamentally reject the idea of an algorithm being a form of architecture. So in that sense, let's say the struggle was quite hard at the beginning, but now I think we've been quite successful in the way in which we communicate, and we are many in the number of people who are talking in this way. What I would prefer to say is that I personally just think that I'm very much a register of my own time, so I just reflect a lot of the general interests of the time, and therefore I don't think it's exceptional. It's just
I can tell you that related to our generation, their generation is much more connected, much more linked. There is really a difference.
Which is my generation, have said the opposite. They're saying we were just the same when we were that age. So I'm very pleased that Claudia.
I think there's a very interesting generation because they are very, in a way, compact and diverse. Yes.
Sorry, one final thing. I think it's this word generation which I find very hard to deal with, because I think... yeah, but I know actually, but no, but I just reflect on it now. I just reflect on this now because I just want to say something about what it means to get old, right? Because when I was very small, allow me some personal reflection a moment. When I was very young, when I was about 9, I met a veteran from World War I, and he was in his 90s. And at that time, every year in my primary school, there would be a Veterans Day, and all of the survivors from World War II and earlier wars would come. And I remember meeting people at that time, people from World War II who were in their 60s. They were old men and old women. When you were 65 as a woman, you looked old. You felt old, right? Now, if I think of my mom, my mother is 65, and she still has the mentality of a teenager. Also, the connection between us, my grandmother's generation, you know, Bing Crosby, the generation of music and of cinema, my mother doesn't want to watch Fred Astaire, right? Well, I quite like Fred Astaire, but my mom doesn't want to watch this. Whereas if I think of the records that came out when my mom was young, you know, Rolling Stones and so on and so on, I still listen to this music. I still look like someone in my basic aesthetic who could be from 40 years ago, right? So let's say I think the boundaries between what it means to get old and the boundaries of where generation lie, maybe not so strict anymore. And therefore I feel a lot of sympathy, a lot of desire, and a lot of, let's say, openness to try and engage with people who come from different times in the same way that you come from different places. It's the same thing. You find people who live in the same city who are prejudiced and you don't like them. And you find people who come from the same time as you who are completely closed. And you find people who are 50 years older than you who are remarkable people which you wish that somehow you could close that 50 years to be with them for longer. Anyway, that's my comment about generations.
Okay.
And yet there are differences.
Well, yes, you talk to my daughter. Anyway, not somebody else's question.
You say
It's
something.
on our treatment.
Thanks for your talk. I was very surprised on the image that you all mentioned. Somehow the architect as a civil servant. So I would like to know if you have the possibility to give suggestions to the RIBA and the and your own school of architecture, or to reform somehow their own school. What kind of suggestion you will give?
I just started teaching this year for the first time at the Architectural Association, so this is a very relevant question. And I started teaching with a Spanish architect called Guillermo Lopez, who is from Barcelona, really remarkable architect. Firstly, RIBA, for me, it's a problematic institution. I don't think I have anything really to say to them directly because I don't know how this entity, what it will become in the future, because previously you have much stronger hierarchy of institutions and information where the institute holds all the knowledge and it has all the members. You become an automatic member, you join it. But now, of course, in my generation, almost no one is a member of RIBA. Okay, let me put it this way. In the group of people who are under 35, there are almost no members of RIBA. So I don't speak for myself or what I think about the institute, but the institute is just from a factual point of view not relevant to people who are under 35. Why? I don't know how they can reform. They should pay me to come and do some consultancy, and then I will talk to them about it. But with regards to education, of course, it's more problematic because schools have this, they're trying to produce people who can get employed, and therefore they can't deviate too much from the realities of work. On the other hand, you hope that it's a place where you can also shape. I mean, in a way, I would prefer to talk to like the mayor of the city and talk to them about what architecture can do. In a way, I almost don't want to talk anymore to architects. We know how awesome and amazing and fantastic architecture is, but somehow we have failed to suggest to the state, or failed to suggest to the city, what we can do and what we are capable of. And in that sense, I would like to try and convince more people involved in, more like public practice, people who are involved in civic engagement with the city, and basically say to them, like, you've got a problem, we can help with that. That's what I would like to do.
Well, what to say? Well, practically, I would say that none of us is in the order in Italy, I think. So I cannot even, like, really say anything about that. I don't even know very much the institution. I hope that soon I will manage to be part of it if I want to perform and sign projects that I will eventually have. Regarding education, I think that teaching and learning in Italy is an experience that is quite diverse than what you could have in Britain. In the sense that in Italy there is still, I feel, a very strict series of knowledge that you need to accumulate somehow to be accepted to really become an architect. Yet, what I really found in my personal experience and of the people that I found is that they were really in the need of looking for what interested them outside of the school. I personally studied in Milan, and what I found more interesting about Milan is not literally the courses that I did, but rather the environment in which I was embedded, where there are the magazines, there are some emerging practices, and so on. And another thing that I know that in Rome is very much present as well, but is the fact that people tend to organize and consolidate groups around interests. Let's say that somehow the school was, at my time, when I graduated, not yet capable of opening up spaces for us, but rather to give us a very precise set of knowledges that we need to fulfill in order to become architects. Whereas in Britain, I found a world that is completely different, in which you really, or at least in the Architectural Association, in which you are given somehow a lot of freedom to really pursue your own interests. Yet, if there would be an only little bit of, let's say, downside of it, is that you are given so much freedom that somehow is not for everyone. Whereas for us, the final outcome is an average architect. There are a lot of average architects, and I'm part of them. Like, we have all this common and shared knowledge. Whereas they tend to either, they tend to have a lot of very interesting figures. But on the other hand, the people that are a little bit weaker, they tend to be somehow excluded, in a way.
That's a really good question. It's like huge, important question. I could think about that for the next few years. But I guess just off the top of my head, like the UK, which I guess you know, it sounds like you know quite well, is sort of stuck in a sort of limbo land, where in the 1990s the major government wanted to deregulate the architectural profession, but then they had other problems, and it sort of stopped halfway. And so we have a situation where the title is protected, so you cannot call yourself an architect unless you go through the very, very rigorous sort of minimum 6 to 7 years process of becoming an architect. But you can practice architecture, which is bizarre. So anybody can do a building in England. Anybody can sign off on a building in England. And yet people will spend £100,000 going through their education, borrowing like crazy, suffering through one of the most difficult forms of education and brilliant forms of education that you can do, to have something which is effectively constantly undermined in the marketplace at the moment. So I feel like for me there's a decision that needs to be made finally. It's typical British fudge, right, with Brexit. Like we never know what we want. It's always one thing or the other. And if we can sort of do a mix that isn't really a solution that we all kind of agree on, we'll go with that. And that's where architecture is. But it would be great if it could decide to totally deregulate and just get rid of the name architect completely, so that there was no official qualification, okay? So people could do the education, but perhaps it was shorter, and the RIBA was there, but it was not a professional body. Well, it isn't. I mean, the ARB is the professional body, but it was totally open. Then it would expand the idea of what architecture was, okay? Or close it again. Make it like other countries. So I prefer the open option, but I'm a sort of, and it's this terrible limbo land. And what we have is there's this limbo land stuck with an education system from the 1950s. So we have, in the 1950s, Part 3 was constructed. So it's a very rigorous system. I think in Australia sort of followed a very similar model, where you have to go through these 7 years. You do part 1, you do part 2, you do part 3, 5 years continuous education, 1 year out, then you have at least 1 or 2 years working in an office. Hopefully, if you have the right experience, you have a viva, you have a live exam, you have case study. It's incredibly complex. Sorry? Last June. Congratulations. I gave up. So I've never done it. I mean, it was. And Zaha, they failed her like how many times? So there's that system, but you don't get anything out of it. And so I teach at Central St. Martin. Just like I have the most wonderful colleagues. Sort of, it's very sort of socially engaged school. I'm kind of like the aesthetic one in the school, but I really love being around them. But I feel guilty. Like there's these students who go through 3 incredibly rigorous years, which are very expensive now because the coalition government got rid of funding for students, and we have to pay up to it's £9,500 in almost all universities every year. Plus you have to pay for housing. Plus you have to pay for models. Plus you have to pay for printing. Plus you have to pay for software. Plus you have to pay for your computer. Plus you have to pay for travel because most people don't live directly in London. It's unbelievable the amount of expenses that these students have to go through. Then they have a year out where they have unpaid internships in Japan or whatever. Then they come back, and then they have another 2 years. And this only made sense in the 1950s. So I would say, RIBA decide, if it's going to be an open system, then we cut it down to 3 years of education. We make rules where people cannot spend lots of money on printing and on making beautiful models so that it's an expense. We say that everybody has to spend a fixed amount of money which is given to them by the university. That's it. Everybody has to use particularly same software which is funded by the university, and then they go out and they can do what they want. Or if it's a professional system, we go back to how we were. But it's like Brexit. We need to decide.
Possiamo...
Veloce. Ci cacciano. It's a very simple question coming back to the Mean Home exhibition. I just wanted to ask, why did we Italians got a classical home whilst the Brits got a modern home?
Well, I was very influenced in the design of the house that I did by a group of architects who ran a blog for a number of years called Padania Classics. I find this, I don't know if you're familiar with this website, it doesn't exist anymore, but they made a very good book, which is basically a photograph of course it takes the nationalist rhetoric of the Lega Nord, now just a Lega, and tried to show like what is the great north of Italy. And if you follow, basically it's everything along the Autostrada A8, I think, or A4, A8? A4. It's the famous A4, and of course basically documenting everything along it. And I'm very interested by this because actually a lot of Italians live in this architecture, and I'm very interested, of course Rome is a very beautiful city, but I'm also interested in the suburb, in the countryside. In one of my favorite films is L'Église by Antonioni. So I'm very interested in this type of urban environment. So the classical reference of the dome is just because I was trying to be a bit more like Adam, trying to be a bit more fun, but you can see that I don't have a great sense of humor, so it didn't really work. But it was a desire, let's say, not to produce a classical building, but to produce something which is really more, let's say, for a suburb, let's say. I don't know if that's a good answer.
No, well, in our case, I think that what we try to do, as I was trying to explain earlier, is that we literally needed to do a little bit of research in order to understand a little bit the context, because somehow we do have a knowledge, yet we didn't want to do something that was too much rhetoric, yet we have used cliches. I mean, we tried to have a little bit of a nuanced position in between drastic data, like a dramatic data, cultural references, and a little bit what you expect it to be. So eventually that product is let's say the mix of all these three approaches that are not really linear. It might look more modern, yet probably that kind of facade is not really immediate and doable. But it was our way to, let's say, interpret these different layers of the research that we did on his brief, I would say.
Which one would you want to live in?
None of them.
we do it again. Are you a Georgian town?
Okay, now we go. Okay, I think we need to go. We will look the house and exhibition. Thank you to you. It's very nice time. Thank you.